Marvina Puri. I'm a developer at Condé Nast. So, oh,
It's working, Mom.
it is working. I just don't know how to use this. All right, so I'm a developer at Condé Nast, and I'll be talking to you guys a little bit about Bootstrap today. Just a show of hands, who here has worked with Bootstrap before? All right, so there are quite a few who haven't worked with Bootstrap. Because I don't know, you haven't. You have worked with Bootstrap, right?
I have not.
Okay, awesome. This talk is for people who've not worked with Bootstrap because I think it's awesome, especially if you don't know what Bootstrap is, because that's where I was. I had heard of Bootstrap, I just didn't know what it was. It was something magical that was there to help you create awesome websites. So what is Bootstrap? It is nothing but a nice open source framework written for front-end development by Twitter. So it comes from a credited source. If you log onto Twitter, whatever you see on the front end is actually written in Bootstrap. What it actually boils down to is just a compilation of lovely CSS and some jQuery plugins. They also have some compilation of HTML templates, so to help you get started with your website. So then you ask yourself, why do you want to use Bootstrap? What are some of the use cases? So these are the use cases that I thought I would use Bootstrap for. The first one being not a front-end engineer, which is what I am. I am not a front-end engineer. I've done only back-end development for the longest time. But every now and then you do come across opportunities when you have no choice but to do some front-end development. In my experience, we had to spin up very quickly a development portal to expose our internal APIs. And Bootstrap just seemed to be the obvious choice for everyone. I had to spend maybe a couple hours in getting this development portal up and ready. And trust me, I'm not a front-end engineer by any means. I have no idea how to write nice, beautiful CSS, but that's where Bootstrap came to my rescue. Second use case would be something that I'm thinking a lot of you can probably associate with, which is you just don't have the bandwidth, you don't have the time, you have strict constraints, but you still need to develop a nice, rich user experience website. So that's when Bootstrap might come to your rescue. And if none of these use cases apply to you, you're this awesome front-end guru who's, sips on their coffee in the morning and creates their own CSS grids and writes these awesome menu items and nav bars. So, why use Bootstrap? Because I can write better framework than Bootstrap. It is great for prototyping. Sometimes you just want to whip out a quick prototype to get your idea across. So that's when Bootstrap can be helpful too. So now that we know there are things that Bootstrap provides, let's look at some of the core features that I had a chance to work with. So in my mind, Bootstrap has like these two big categories of things that it helps you out with. One is its ability to do page layouts, and the other one, which is very famous, is its reusable components that are these amazing CSS and jQuery plugins. So you want to work with alerts, nav bars, carousels. Bootstrap has components for you. So let's talk a little about page layout. Page layout is basically nothing but a way for you to arrange your components on a web page. In a grid layout, you do this using a grid, which is rows and columns. This is nothing new that Bootstrap invented or came up with. Long before Bootstrap, web designers used to think about their design in form of a grid, put it on a piece of paper, take it to a web developer, and that's when you implement it. Where Bootstrap really shines is in how easy it makes it for you to actually implement a grid system. So let's take a quick look at this example. We have 3 rows here, and this is a 9-column grid, which basically means that every row span can have 9 columns. So the first row here, so I have 3 divs. The first row here, okay, my first column needs to span 4 columns. How do I do this in Bootstrap? You use a class, a CSS class called span4. It's extremely intuitive. Then look at the second one. You have 3 offset 2. So something special about this column is I want it to span 3 columns, but I need it to be a little bit to the right. So I want to offset it by 2. Again, what's the class in CSS for Bootstrap? It's offset 2. So like the naming scheme of these CSS classes is so intuitive that you're not going back and forth. Once you've decided what's the layout you're working with, you just start coding it. So example of this. Right here we have 2 rows. The first rows are navbar, second rows are content. So if you look at the first row navbar, we're using class row. Let's take a look in this one. We have one div that is spanning 11 columns, and we wanted it to start a little bit to the right, so we gave it an offset 1. That's it. That's all I needed to know. If I wanted to move a little bit further, I would make this an offset of 2. This particular example is using the default grid layout that comes with Bootstrap, which is a 12-column grid layout. So the only thing I have to keep in mind is span for every row should just add up to 12. That's it. Let's look at the second row. What do we have here? Okay, so we have 3 divs here. Each one of them is spanning 3 columns, and the first one has an offset of 3, so it's a little bit to the right. That's all I had to do to get all these margins right and get the grid system correctly laid out. Oh, gets better. And it's responsive. Yeah, which is pretty awesome for me, because I was like, okay, I don't want to write any media queries, so this is awesome. All I have to do is drop in this file called Bootstrap responsive, and it works like magic. Right. Next is just components. And me actually so components is the piece that I was talking to you guys before, which is another big feature of Bootstrap that people like using. You can go on Bootstrap site, and it's filled with amazing components that you can use. You want to add breadcrumbs, navbar, drop downs. It has really good examples, markup you can use, you can fiddle with it. They have some live examples. So if we go back to the example we were using for our grid layout, right in this example, there's at least 2 components that are being used. One is the navbar. So if we look right here, we're using the navbar component from Bootstrap. And the first item in a navbar happens to be this fancy little drop down that again is another component from Bootstrap. So I would just say spend some time on Bootstrap's component section, and I'm sure you'll find something that is pretty useful for your website. All right, so Bootstrap's awesome, but we want more. If you go on Google and literally just look for Bootstrap themes, it's quite overwhelming of how many themes people have written for Bootstrap. Some are pretty awesome, some are, I don't know, you want to play around with them before using it. The one that I used in the development portal example that I was talking to earlier was Flat UI. So if you like the Flat UI, which is like the Microsoft Surface-y look and feel, go ahead and try that. I actually have an example right in that one. So this is just using the default Bootstrap theme. I downloaded the Flat UI theme. All I have to do is include the Flat UI CSS. Let's refresh this. Voila. See, these fonts change, colors change. This was my favorite part. You get this nice little drop down just by adding Flat UI CSS. Another site that I really liked was Bootswatch. It's basically an aggregator, has dozens of themes there that you can just look at some screenshots, download it, play with it. So that's pretty neat too. And that's about it. So Bootstrap FTW, for the longest time I used to think the FTW stands for fuck the what? So like servers down. So here I stand corrected. Bootstrap for the win. Download it. Get bootstrap.com. It has a great download builder, very customizable. You can overwrite the grid layout not to be 12 columns, 15 columns, whatever fits your need. If you have any questions, please feel free to email jp.johnpaul@condense.com. That's it. Thank you.
Alrighty, good night everyone. My name is Kacy James. I work at easybib.com. That's just a citation generator. And it's the largest sub-citation generator, and I'm an ad operations engineer there. I program primarily in JavaScript. but I do a myriad of other things, which I won't get into here. But tonight, I'm here to talk to you about, not my widgets, here to talk to you about Ember.js. And this is going to be a very high-level talk. We're going to touch on some technical details, but we're going to start out by talking about how we got where we are today. So not so long time ago, 2006 to be exact, John Russig concocted jQuery here in New York, and that opened the floodgates for easy DOM manipulation. Prior to jQuery, if you wanted to manipulate anything in the DOM, you were beholden to cross-browser inconsistencies and a number of other things. So that really opened up the floodgates to more consistent, faster front-end web development, an area that had been neglected prior to 2006. Immediately following that, the web got into a rut. We're still talking about mainly content-oriented sites that display things like text, like blogs, news sites, and a lot of development with jQuery on the front end, was centered around replicating things that existed with Flash, like those lens flares, slideshows, things that are like truly mundane, things that we beat to death on the desktop. So in spite of these strides of programmability, the websites just remained websites, right? We didn't go back to the app-like functionality that we experienced through platforms like Flash with Flex. We just sort of were in a rut. And at this point, between 2006 and 2010, crafting app-like experiences like Gmail and Google Maps still takes, one of these guys to architect, a genius, and an army of these guys, devs, to code. You can see this guy, he's like really ready. He's like, oh yeah, I'm gonna write Google Maps. Yeah, people from other environments are thinking, they're starting to program on the web, and they're like, wait, we've killed this problem on the desktop. We have no problem with code organization. We can do the things we want to do. And ultimately, it boils down to a number of things, including a dearth of processing power on the client side. So as processing power on the client side has increased, we have a broader range of things that we can do smoothly on the client side. So as I said before, the web was mainly consisted of content-driven sites like blogs and news sites. I think something is out of order here. Wow. So a paradigm. So on the web, oftentimes developers, you just write jQuery, you'd end up with a bunch of callbacks, and you'd have some spaghetti. And it's like, how am I going to maintain this? You don't really worry about that. You just come back to it when when you have to maintain the application. But in other environments, they're beholden to design patterns such as MVC, the model view controller, which is the model view controller paradigm. While all this is going on in the front end, all this development on the back end, these back end engineers are plowing through these problems. So in a traditional MVC web application architecture, the server takes care of most of the moving parts of the application. So I'm sorry. So for example, things like rendering templates and interacting with your database, it handles the gamut. Like if you need to display a list of users, you'd write a template, which is your view and a controller, and it would grab those things. And it was a monolithic, and it's a monolithic architecture, centered around clients that have relatively low computing power. More recently, what we've started to see is an alternative approach in which the server side acts more as client. I'm sorry. It's more service oriented, and the front end taking on a lot of the responsibilities that were held by the back end. And that's what you're seeing with frameworks like Ember.js. Frameworks like Ember.js enable. Okay, so I'm going down the wrong road with that. So first and foremost, what frameworks like Ember.js are targeted at doing is allowing developers to organize large code bases. That's really what the goal is here, right? Because prior to MVC frameworks, your code is all over the place. So I'm here to tell you what makes Ember.js so awesome, and that's there are a few key things such as bindings, computer properties, and auto updating templates. So I'll just very briefly go over bindings. So what we mean when we say bindings is that we can have properties in our application that are linked together at the base level. So for example, here we have in our app we have a wife, and wife has an attribute of household income. And we also have husband, and he has a household income binding. And it's bound to his wife's household income. So that in our application, when the husband's household income goes up, the wife's household income also goes up. And this makes it easier to, you don't have to worry about updating your properties prior to this sort of setup, you probably would have, ended up with some sort of callback soup. So I'll just very briefly show you some examples of auto updating templates and computer properties. So here we have a tool that I built that's a clone of Trello a few months ago. And we see that we have a count of each of the cards on each board. And if I take this card here and I move it along to this board, we see that the template is automatically updated with that value. And I won't get into the technical details of how exactly that works, but these are just some of the things that make Ember such a pleasure to work with. So before we go any further, I'd like to stress that the purpose of MVC frameworks like Ember.js and Angular is not to build ordinary websites. They're to enable app-like experiences. So for your typical blog or your news site, you can definitely throw those frameworks at those problems, but ideally, you'd only want to use those frameworks where they're applicable, because you don't want to use a hammer on a screw, right? So Ember originated as a fork of an Apple-sponsored framework that set out to do the same sort of things that Ember does, called Sprout Core. So now we're gonna get into what you need to get started with an Ember application. You'll need three things. At the base level, you'll need jQuery 1.91, Ember.js 1.0, which just reached that milestone not too long ago, and Handlebars 1.0. And you can find those at the Ember.js.com homepage. For all of you that use like package managers and things like that, I'm sure there's probably like a grunt package or something in Bower that you can access that way. But if you just want to get started and you just want to fool around and don't have to configure your environment, you can just head over to Ember.js.com and set that up. So when I was starting out, I'd read a lot of posts by people that were confused about Ember and you ran into the whole source order problem when you're writing your application, and plenty of you are saying, AMD, what do you mean source order problem? But yeah, if you're just fooling around, downloading that starter kit I just mentioned should alleviate this issue. But if there's any doubt and you're starting from scratch, just keep note that this is the order: jQuery, handlebars, Ember, and then of course your application. And your base. So when you're starting out, your base document looks very similar to HTML, with the exception of a few things that we see here, like these really funky looking brackets. So what's that about? So let's step back and take a high level view at the structure of an Ember application at its view layer. So Ember apps at the view layer are comprised of templates, components, the application's router and its routes, models, and controllers. Now that's a lot to take in. Okay, yeah. But yeah, these are the things that comprise an Ember app. Templates would be your view layer. Components, which is a bit more new, which I won't get into too much detail. Allow you to build essentially reusable components. Like, for example, let's say you wanted to have a calendar component that you wanted to be reusable throughout your app. You could build that and have it. I mean, the calendar is sort of mundane, but I guess the example they have on the site is you enter in your email address and then your Gravatar image being updated. And then there's your application router and its associated routes. So the router is a pretty big thing, which I'll talk about soon, and then it wraps up with models and controllers. So far, that template we looked at looks like a traditional website, right? But then we have this funky stuff that I was talking about earlier, and this is handlebars template. And if any of you have done any back-end development, you'll notice that it looks very similar to code that you might write in your back-end ERB template or what have you. And this is how your information makes it from. This is how your user is able to interact with the models that you've constructed in your app. So for this example, we have an item in the model, and we'll iterate for as many items that are in the model, and we'll display that in the interface. And it doesn't modify the HTML file. This all happens in DOM. So what exactly is a template in the context of an Ember application? It describes the user interface of your application, and each one of those templates that I mentioned is backed by your model. Like many other templating languages, templates can contain expressions, outlets, and components, and that comprises the view layer. Then there's the model layer, which is very similar to model if you're familiar with it, but it stores persistent state. So, things like a number of visits or a number of emails or what have you, would be stored here while your application is running in the browser. Now that is not that isn't necessarily the same as what's stored in your database, but for the most part it usually lines up with the data structures you have therein. And I touched on the routes earlier. So routes help you maintain state in your application. This allows your application to be neatly segmented into states that are easily reproducible by URL. So if you're using this great app and you want your friend to see a particular view that you're in, it's as simple as copying the URL, sending it off to your friend, and they'll be in the same place you were in your application. So now I'm going to just very quickly walk through an application that was done by Tom Dale of the core Ember team. It's called Blogger. And if I can just get this to work, because it seems not to want to cooperate. Okay. Something is not totally here. Sorry. I don't know what happened. Sorry. Wow.
Sadly, I think we're out of time.
Okay.
If there are any questions, feel free.
So have you worked with Ember with HTML5 history instead of the hash?
No, I have not.
Okay, because I just started messing with that last night.
Oh, and how do you?
Any problems with it?
Oh no, I haven't used. Is that the recommended method, or is that an option? Do they suggest using?
So, I mean, I haven't seen any of my tutorials that actually had it done with history. I've only seen it done with a hash. So then I started digging around, and I found a way that you know there's an option. I had to like defer readiness, and I was just messing around with it. I was wondering if you succeeded with it.
Oh no. I mainly have used the traditional routing. Like for example, this is a different version of my application, but I've normally used the traditional routing.
I've used it and enjoyed it greatly. Sorry.
That's right. I haven't worked with Ember. I have worked a little bit with Angular, and a lot of what you covered seems very similar, which is not surprising. I was just wondering, just at a very high level, is there anything that makes Ember particularly shine over other MVC JavaScript, MVC frameworks? Any particular feature that's like, wow, this doesn't exist?
Well, this is I think it's totally subjective, but I feel like a lot of the code generation that Ember does, which I didn't speak about here because I feel like that's a little more in depth, is very convenient. Like for example, if you create your model, a controller is also generated for that model implicitly, and it comes with a set of defaults, and I feel like that accelerates development in a big way. Would you want to add any?
Sure. So my gut reaction to that question is that the pieces that Ember gives you that are not what Angular also gives you, because they really do solve very, very similar problems, are all around making sure that you can't do things that shoot yourself in the foot. For example, in Angular, you're allowed to inject anything into anything. For if you want to have a template helper that includes like what happens to be in your route parameters, you can do that. Whereas Ember like refuses to. You have to jump through thousands of hoops, or lots of hoops, to do things like that. So Ember forces you down the Railsy opinionated way in a lot of things. And depending on what you like, I enjoy that significantly.
I believe you had a question.
And it's sort of a similar question, sort of comparing it to the pros and cons of other frameworks, like why would you pick Ember over something else? What is it good at, or what is it not as good at compared to things like Backbone or Knockout or Angular or whatever?
Oh, okay.
It's like, Backbone tries to be small, simple, bolt on your extras,
Data
Knockout has
bindings,
no controllers and routers, right? It's MVVM. Like what's Ember good at compared to the other, or not, or tries to stay away from?
I don't think I'm qualified to answer that question because I've only worked with Ember. But if anyone else has any,
Backbone doesn't have any data binding built in at all. You basically working around events. I mean, it's nice, but
it's Backbone is an event library. It's not an MVC framework at all. Does anyone have any experience with Knockout?
I've done Knockout, so I haven't used it, but that's why.
So Knockout is just
my
the data
name goes
binding.
up, but Knockout.
So I think that Ember, as Kacy said earlier, Ember is intended to be for app-like experiences, and that's like a quote-unquote thing. But it's supposed to be, it is very, very useful for applications, not just I want to read a blog post and I want to read another blog post, but rather I want to interact with my data in a very, very like rich way. And that, because, for example, it takes care of your URL completely for you, and you don't have to worry about, you set up what's called a router, and when you hit refresh, it knows how to get data correctly for you. You have to do a no mapping that says like if your parameter is user equals 12, something like that. This is because
You
I've
feel
done.
like it's sort of fairly opinionated and does a lot of things sort of automatically.
It has done
right?
everything that I have done with bugs in Backbone multiple times, and then found more bugs in, and then realized that I'm so stupid and I don't know what I'm doing. I tried again. This is what Ember has helped. Please,
One last question. As far as Ember goes, one common complaint I've seen is that documentation isn't that great, or there's just not a lot of resources out there to really help you get going. I was wondering if maybe there's some good resources you guys could recommend for people getting started.
Oh yeah, definitely. So I'll be giving JP a link to my slides at the very end. There's a link to a blog post that has a very extensive number of resources. Some of them not too up to date. I don't know. One thing I found about the Ember community is that they like to rely a lot on video, which I really dislike because I can't. I feel like I have to, code at the pace of the video. But there are. I think it's getting better, but it's still an area in which it's lacking, especially like I've taken a tangential look at like the documentation of Angular, and it's just I feel it's light years ahead, but it has certainly gotten better.
Angular documentation?
Yeah, yeah.
Our complaint about the Angular documentation.
Yeah. I mean,
it's all in videos, and we spend all of our time going through the videos and catching up on the. And it's
PhoneCat doesn't do enough for you.
yeah, PhoneCat is and PhoneCat is lagging a version and a half behind now.
Oh,
and they've
really?
redone some of the best practices, which if you're up to date on the mailing list,
Right.
you're up to date on.
So I'm gonna say